I've always been an outdoorsy person. My family camped constantly when I was growing up. And even as an adult, I still spend a lot of time hiking alone or staying out in parks for a few days just to clear my head. I'm a teacher, so during winter, spring, and summer break, I usually take short camping trips somewhere quiet. Being outside has always helped me mentally, especially during difficult periods in my life. This happened during winter break a few years ago. At the time, I was going through a rough patch personally, and I remember desperately needing silence more than anything else. A heavy snowfall had just hit the area, and despite the cold, the whole landscape looked beautiful in this almost unreal way. Fresh snow covered everything, the air was still, and the woods had that muffled quietness snow creates, where the entire world feels softer. Most people avoid camping in weather like that. I love it. So I packed up my trailer and booked a campsite for 3 nights in a wooded park I'd visited before. When I arrived, the place was practically empty. I think I only saw one other vehicle the entire first day. Everyone else clearly had more sense than me and stayed home where it was warm. The second night was when it happened. The moon was incredibly bright that night. Not enough to make the woods feel safe exactly, but enough to cast this pale blue glow over the snow so you could see surprisingly far between the trees. It was honestly beautiful. The kind of night that makes you forget how cold you are. I remember standing outside my trailer for a while, just listening to the silence before deciding to take a walk. I knew the trails well enough, and I'd done countless nighttime hikes before. At first, the walk was peaceful. The snow crunched softly under my boots, and every now and then, wind would shake snow loose from branches overhead. Other than that, nothing. No people, no distant traffic, just woods and moonlight. About 2/3 through the trail, I heard something move off to my left. A sharp crunch, like a hoof slipping in snow. My first thought was deer. Then immediately after that, I assumed maybe another hiker had startled some wildlife nearby. I stopped walking and looked toward the sound, and I felt fear hit me so hard it was almost physical. You know that sudden adrenaline rush where your hearing changes and everything feels unreal for a second? That happened instantly. At first, I could only make out the silhouette standing between the trees. Tall, way too tall. Even now, trying to describe it makes me feel ridiculous, because part of me still wants to convince myself I imagined it. But I know what I saw. The figure had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its arms hung unnaturally low, almost to its knees, and it stood upright like a person, not like an animal rearing up, not like a bear. A person. Except wrong somehow. Its proportions looked stretched and uneven in a way my brain immediately rejected. The closest comparison I can think of are those creepy skinwalker drawings online. But honestly, I don't even like using that word because I don't think this was anything supernatural. At least I hope not. The strangest part wasn't its appearance, though. It was the way it reacted to me. It looked surprised. Genuinely surprised. Like it hadn't expected to see another living thing out there. We just stood there staring at each other from maybe 20 feet away. And for a few seconds, I had this bizarre realization that whatever fear I was feeling, it almost seemed to be feeling the same thing. Not aggression, curiosity, confusion. Its head tilted slightly to one side, almost bird-like, and it leaned forward a little, as if trying to understand what it was looking at. I remember thinking very clearly, if it wants to hurt me, I won't make it back to the trail. That thought snapped me partially back to reality. I should have run immediately. Instead, and I still don't fully understand why I did this. I slowly reached into my satchel and pulled out a piece of beef jerky. Maybe because my brain was desperately trying to turn the situation into something normal, like feeding a nervous stray animal. I tossed the jerky toward it. The figure immediately stepped backward. Not aggressively, more startled than anything. Then it looked down at the snow where the jerky landed. Slowly, it crouched down and picked it up. Its movements were oddly careful, deliberate, almost human, and somehow that made it worse. For another second, it just held the jerky while staring at me. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. Not ran, walked. Within a few steps, the darkness and snow swallowed it completely. The second it disappeared, every ounce of fear I'd been holding back and hit me all at once. I turned around and sprinted back toward the campsite, harder than I think I've ever run in my life. I remember slipping in the snow twice trying to get back to the trailer. Once I got there, I didn't stop to think logically about it anymore. I threw everything into the trailer, packed up as fast as I could, and left immediately. I didn't care about the extra night I'd paid for. I didn't even bother formally checking out. I just needed to get away from those woods. Even now, years later, I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. Part of me tries to rationalize it. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe moonlight playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe some bizarre combination of shadows and adrenaline. But there's another part of me that remembers the way it tilted its head while looking at me. Not like a predator. Like something encountering another creature it didn't fully understand. A few years ago, I went on a camping trip with a group of friends deep in the forests of British Columbia. And to this day, it's still the only experience I genuinely cannot explain. We weren't partying or doing anything stupid either. One of the guys in our group was staying sober at the time, so the whole trip was dry. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing that could explain what all 6 of us saw that night. We'd driven a long way down an old logging road and set up camp in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The area was extremely remote. No cabins, no campsites nearby, no roads past where we were. Just trees. If you've ever been in old-growth forest at night, you know it has a certain feeling to it. Even when it's quiet, it's never truly silent. There are always frogs, insects, distant birds, branches moving in the wind, some kind of life around you. Earlier that night, the forest sounded completely normal. We were sitting around the fire talking when one of my friends suddenly stopped mid-conversation. He tilted his head slightly like he was listening to something far away. Then he quietly said, "Guys, shut up for a second." The tone in his voice immediately got everyone's attention. We stopped talking, and that's when I noticed it too. The forest had gone silent. Not quieter, silent. Completely dead silent. I remember hearing nothing except the faint crackling of the fire beside us. No frogs, no wind, no insects, nothing. It was so sudden and unnatural that it triggered something instinctive in me immediately. That primal fight-or-flight feeling your body gets before your brain fully catches up. One of the guys whispered that maybe there was a cougar or bear nearby because animals sometimes go quiet when predators are around. That explanation actually made us feel a little better at first, because at least it was something rational. Then we saw the light. Far back in the trees, maybe 100 feet away, this glowing red orb appeared between the trunks. And when I say glowing, I mean it looked like it produced its own light. Not a flashlight, not headlights, not reflected light. It looked like a sphere filled with fire, about the size of a beach ball. The thing moved slowly through the trees at about walking speed, drifting between them in complete silence. I remember all 6 of us just freezing. Nobody spoke. It was clearly moving behind some trees and in front of others, so it wasn't a reflection or trick of perspective. And the woods there were incredibly dense. If a person had been carrying something glowing through the brush, we would have heard branches snapping or footsteps. There was nothing. Just that red light floating through the darkness. The glow it gave off faintly illuminated nearby branches as it moved. The color wasn't bright like neon either. It flickered softly, almost like embers inside glass. And I cannot properly explain the fear that hit me when my eyes locked onto it. I've had dangerous things happen to me in my life before. I almost died in an accident a couple years after this happened, and honestly, that didn't scare me as much as this did. Because this felt wrong on a deeper level. It was like my brain kept trying to identify what I was looking at and failing over and over again. And the harder it tried, the worse the fear became. The orb drifted silently through the trees for maybe 20 seconds before slowly fading out. Not darting away, not vanishing instantly, just dimming until it wasn't there anymore. Then about 10 seconds later, the forest sounds came back all at once. Frogs, wind, insects, everything. Like someone had flipped reality back on. The second that happened, every instinct in my body screamed to leave. Nobody even needed to say it. We all stood up almost immediately. There were a few quiet exchanges between us, mostly confirming that we had all seen the same thing. And then we grabbed flashlights and walked toward where the light had been. I think we were desperate for an explanation. Maybe someone camping, maybe a lantern, maybe literally anything logical. But there was nothing there. No road, no footprints, no campsite, nothing hanging in the trees. And honestly, not finding anything somehow made it worse. Because if there had been evidence of a person out there, I could have accepted that. Instead, it felt like the woods themselves had briefly shown us something impossible. We packed up quickly and left. About 20 or 30 minutes away, we found a paid campsite that was still open and decided to stay there instead. It was around 1 in the morning when the owner came by to check us in. She seemed friendly at first, joking about how unusual it was for people to show up that late. We awkwardly explained what had happened, mostly joking, at least trying to joke. But the moment we described the red light and the silence in the forest, her expression completely changed. She got serious immediately. She started asking detailed questions. Where exactly were we? How deep in the forest? How big was the light? Did it move normally? Did the woods go quiet before it appeared? That reaction unsettled me almost as much as the experience itself. Eventually, she told us the area we'd been camping in was part of an extremely old-growth forest, and that stories like ours weren't uncommon there. She never fully explained what she meant by that. And honestly, I didn't want her to. Even now, years later, all 6 of us still occasionally bring that night up when we get together. And every single time we do, I end up having nightmares afterward. Not because I think it was supernatural necessarily, but because I've never found an explanation that feels remotely right. The thing I remember most clearly isn't even the light itself. It's the silence before it appeared. That overwhelming feeling that the entire forest knew something was there before we did. Back in the mid to late 1980s, my parents belonged to this camping club made up of several families who would travel around the Midwest together during the summers. There were usually 6 or 7 couples, all with kids around similar ages. So for me and my sister, it always felt like a huge adventure. This particular trip took place at a campground built around a large pond. There was a small playground nearby with a sandbox, swings, and one of those old metal jungle gyms that burned your hands in the summer heat. I was around 10 years old at the time, and my sister was a little younger. One afternoon, the two of us were sitting in the sandbox, playing by ourselves, while most of the adults relaxed back at the campsites, drinking coffee and talking. Everything felt normal. Then suddenly this boy was just there. I never saw him walk up. One second it was just me and my sister, and the next this kid was standing a few feet away inside the sandbox, staring down at us. He looked older than me, probably 12 or 13. He had long black hair hanging down near his shoulders, pale skin, and dark eyes that I still remember weirdly clearly, even now. He wore a black t-shirt and jeans with ripped knees patched over. At first, he didn't say anything. That's honestly one of the parts I remember most. He just stood there silently staring at us for several seconds. No smile, no introduction, just watching. Even as a kid, I remember immediately feeling uncomfortable without fully understanding why. Finally, he asked if we were brother and sister. I told him yes. Then he asked where our camper was. And because I was 10 and not thinking about stranger danger the way kids are taught now, I casually told him which section of the campground we were staying in. It was about 2 blocks away from the playground. Then things got stranger. He asked about one of the couples camping with my parents' group, specifically by name. He asked if we knew them. I remember feeling relieved at first, because suddenly it sounded like maybe he really did belong there. I told him yes, we knew them. That's when he smiled for the first time. He said they were his aunt and uncle, and that he planned to surprise them later. Then he vaguely pointed somewhere across the pond, and said he was camping over there with his dad. At the time, it sounded believable enough. But looking back now, it feels rehearsed. Like he was building trust step by step. After that, he squatted down closer to us in the sand. My sister immediately moved closer to me. I noticed it right away because she usually wasn't shy around other kids. The boy asked if we wanted to come to his campsite. He said his dad brought tons of snacks and marshmallows and candy. I told him we already had marshmallows back at our camper. But he kept going. He started listing all the snacks they supposedly had, like he was trying to find the exact thing that would convince us. Candy bars, soda, chips. The longer he talked, the more uncomfortable I started feeling. There was something strange about how intense he seemed. Like getting us to follow him somewhere was suddenly really important. Finally, my sister quietly said she needed to use the bathroom. Honestly, I think she just wanted to leave too. I immediately took that as an excuse to get away from the conversation. I told the boy we were heading back and that maybe we'd see him later when he surprised his aunt and uncle. But instead of standing up or saying goodbye normally, he leaned closer toward us. That detail still creeps me out. He pointed toward a path leading around the pond and said there were bathrooms near his campsite. Then he added, "You can stop by and get candy from my dad." I remember getting this horrible feeling in my stomach at that moment. Not fear exactly. More like the sudden realization that something about this situation was very wrong. I told him we were just going to use the bathrooms near the main office instead. The office building was directly across from the playground where adults could easily see us. The second I said that, his entire demeanor changed. He jumped to his feet so suddenly it startled both of us. Then he kicked over whatever my sister and I had been building in the sand and yelled, "You're so dumb! Who turns down free candy?" My sister grabbed my arm immediately. We hurried toward the office building while I kept expecting him to follow us. I remember being genuinely scared at that point. Not kid scared, real scared. When we reached the sidewalk near the office, I looked back. The boy was still standing near the sandbox, staring at us. Then after a few seconds, he turned around and ran down the path toward the other side of the pond. Not walked. Ran. I took my sister into the bathroom and waited there a couple minutes before carefully looking around outside again. He was gone. We hurried back to our campsite and immediately told our parents everything. At first, the adults assumed it was probably another camper's kid until we mentioned that he claimed to be the nephew of one of the couples in the camping club. That's when the atmosphere changed, because the couple looked genuinely confused. They said they didn't have a nephew. And what disturbed them most was the fact that this stranger somehow knew who they were. After that, my parents didn't let my sister and me wander off alone for the rest of the trip. And the creepy part is, we never saw the boy again. No sign of him anywhere in the campground. No campsite across the pond. No father. Nothing. Just this strange kid who somehow knew details about our camping group and seemed desperate to lure two children away from a public area. Even now, decades later, I still think about how differently that day could have ended if my sister hadn't said she needed to leave. This happened during my friend's 18th birthday camping trip a few years ago. And out of every creepy thing I've experienced outdoors, this is probably the one that still unsettles me the most. My friend was really into camping, hiking, survival stuff. Basically anything outdoors. He wanted to celebrate his birthday by camping near a lake a couple hours outside town. A bunch of people were invited, but because it was close to graduation season and everyone was busy, only 4 of us actually ended up going. There was me, my friend, his 12-year-old brother, and the brother's friend. The spot we picked was deep enough into the woods that there was no cell service at all. It wasn't an official campsite either, just a small clearing near the lake that looked flat enough to set up a tent. At first, the whole trip felt pretty normal. The only issue was that my friend had forgotten to bring firewood. Normally, that wouldn't have been a huge problem. But because we were so far out and couldn't contact anyone, we ended up cutting our own from nearby trees. If you've ever tried gathering enough firewood using only camping saws and a hatchet, especially from damp trees, you know how exhausting it is. It took all 4 of us hours. By the time we had a decent pile together, the sun was already starting to go down. Everything in the woods was wet from rain earlier that morning, and starting a fire became its own nightmare. For almost an hour, we struggled with it. Smoke everywhere, tiny flames that kept dying, cold fingers. Eventually, using some hand sanitizer from my backpack and partially dried wood from previous failed attempts, we finally got a decent fire going. I still remember the relief of seeing actual flames catch properly. We cooked hot dogs and bacon over the fire and ate like we were starving. By that point, everyone was exhausted. We'd basically spent the entire day chopping wood and hauling it around. So not long after eating, we all piled into the large tent we'd set up in the clearing, and we passed out almost immediately. Sometime during the night, I woke up freezing. The wind outside had gotten really loud, rattling the tent walls and pushing cold air underneath the edges. I remember curling deeper into my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable again. But once I woke up, I couldn't really fall back asleep. I just lay there listening to the woods. At some point, I heard a branch snap outside. At first, I ignored it completely. We were in the middle of the forest. Animals moving around at night wasn't unusual at all. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. That's when I started paying attention. I remember debating whether or not to wake everyone else up, but I felt stupid even considering it. I didn't want to be the paranoid guy waking up the entire tent over a raccoon or deer. Then I heard footsteps. Slow footsteps. Not rustling, not random movement. Distinct steps in the snow and leaves maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the tent. The second I realized that, this awful chill went through me. My immediate thought was cougar or bear. Where we lived in Canada, both were possible. Still terrified, I quietly reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. We also had a hatchet, a compound bow, and a few other camping tools nearby. So I clipped the hatchet onto my belt loop just in case. Looking back now, going outside was probably the dumbest thing I could have done. But at the time, I was trying to convince myself I was being rational. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the freezing dark. The fire had completely died down by then, leaving only faint gray ash glowing in places. The clearing looked totally different at night, smaller somehow. The woods around us felt thicker and closer than they had during the day. I stood there for a minute scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no eye shine, no sound except wind. For a second, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Since I was already awake, I figured I might as well use the bathroom before getting back in the tent. So I stepped a little farther away from camp. And that's when I heard another branch snap. Close. Immediately I froze. Trying not to sound nervous, I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. That silence honestly scared me more than if someone had responded. I took a few careful steps toward the sound, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. And then I saw him. A silhouette standing between the trees. A man. At least, I think it was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, completely still. I couldn't make out his face because of how dark it was. But I remember getting this overwhelming feeling that he'd been standing there for a while watching the tent. Watching us. Panicking, I shouted, "Who are you?" At the same time, I instinctively raised the knife a little. The figure slowly turned toward me. For one horrible second, I thought he was going to start walking closer. Instead, he suddenly turned and sprinted down the trail toward the parking area. Not casually walking away. Running. Fast. The sound of branches and footsteps disappeared into the woods almost immediately. I just stood there frozen, trying to process what had happened. I barely slept the rest of the night after that. Every little sound outside made me jolt awake. The next morning, I told everyone what happened. What really unsettled me was when my friend's younger brother admitted he'd also heard footsteps and branches around 1 in the morning, but had been too scared to say anything. That made the whole thing feel real in a way I couldn't brush off anymore. But the creepiest part came later. In daylight, I went back to the exact area where I'd seen the man standing. Lying on the ground, there was my friend's brother's sweater. He swore he hadn't brought it outside the tent. And honestly, I believe him. The sweater wasn't near the campsite either. It was deep enough into the trees that the wind couldn't realistically have carried it there. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe another camper. Maybe someone high or drunk wandering through the woods. But the thing I can't stop thinking about is this. If I hadn't gone outside when I did, how long would he have kept standing there watching our tent? This story happened to my aunt back in the summer of 1998 when she was in college in Utah. She's told it a few times over the years, and every single time she gets to the ending, she still sounds unsettled by it. At the time, she was dating the guy who later became my uncle. The two of them went camping with another couple at a park somewhere about 50 minutes south of Salt Lake City. It was supposed to be a simple overnight trip. They got there in the afternoon, picked out a campsite, pitched their tents, and spent a few hours hanging around before the weather turned bad. According to my aunt, the rain started early in the evening and came down hard almost immediately. A lot of other campers packed up and left once it became obvious the storm wasn't going away anytime soon. But my aunt and the others decided to wait it out. Eventually, the rain eased up enough for them to start a small campfire. They cooked food, talked for a while, and tried to salvage the night. My aunt always says the part felt strangely peaceful afterward. Wet trees, smoke from the fire, steam rising off the ground. Then, sometime later after it got fully dark, the rain started again. This time, it was worse. The other couple finally gave up and decided to leave altogether rather than spend the night soaked in a storm. They packed their stuff and drove out of the park, leaving my aunt and uncle alone at the campsite. Looking back, my aunt says that's when the atmosphere completely changed. The second the other car's headlights disappeared, the place suddenly felt isolated in a way it hadn't before. Still, they decided to stay. They put out the fire, climbed into their tent, and settled in for the night while rain hammered against the fabric overhead. At some point later that night, my aunt woke up. At first, she couldn't tell what had disturbed her because all she could hear was rain hitting the tent. Then she noticed another sound mixed into it. Footsteps. Slow footsteps somewhere nearby. At first, she convinced herself she imagined it. Rain can make normal sounds seem strange when you're half asleep in a tent. But then she heard it again. Closer this time. Not animal movement either. Actual footsteps circling near the campsite. She sat upright, listening carefully, and then she suddenly saw a brief flash of light through the tent wall. Just for a second, like a flashlight turning on and immediately off again. Her first thought was actually relief. She assumed maybe it was a park ranger checking campsites or warning people about flooding from the storm. So she called out, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped instantly. That silence afterward scared her more than the sound itself. By then my uncle had woken up too. She whispered to him what she'd heard, and both of them stayed completely still, listening through the rain. The problem was the storm muffled everything. Every gust of wind and burst of rain made it impossible to tell whether someone was still nearby or not. They quietly discussed leaving right then, but the weather outside was terrible, and the truck was parked far enough away that running to it in the dark didn't feel safe either. So they agreed on something simple. If they heard anything else, they were leaving immediately. For several minutes, nothing happened. No footsteps, no light. Nothing except rain. Eventually, they both started calming down. My aunt even started feeling embarrassed for panicking over what might have been another camper walking nearby. So they laid back down. Then sometime later, My aunt says she has no idea how much time passed. Both of them woke up at exactly the same moment. Not gradually. Instantly. Because they heard the tent zipper moving. Slowly. Someone outside was unzipping the tent. My aunt screamed immediately. At the same time, my uncle grabbed the large metal flashlight he kept beside him and swung it toward the tent entrance as hard as he could. The flashlight connected with something solid. Not the ground, not a tent pole. A person. They both heard someone grunt or gasp in pain, followed immediately by the sound of fast footsteps running away through the rain. My aunt said that's when pure panic took over. They didn't stop to grab most of their things. They just threw on shoes, burst out of the tent, and ran through the storm toward their truck. The parking area was about half a mile away. Pitch black, pouring rain, mud everywhere. She said they kept expecting whoever had opened the tent to come running out of the woods after them. When they finally reached the truck, things somehow got worse. One of the back tires had been slashed. Not flat, slashed. At that point, they were completely terrified. There were no cell phones back then, no easy way to call for help. And they were stranded in the middle of a storm with someone potentially still nearby. But staying there felt worse than driving on the damaged tire. So they got in the truck and drove anyway. Slowly, carefully, somehow managing to make it out of the park without completely destroying the wheel. A few miles away, they found a gas station and used a payphone to call 911. The next day, they returned with police officers to collect the rest of their camping gear. According to the officers, there were footprints all around the tent, not just passing by either, circling it. The police said the tracks appeared to belong to an adult man, but they never figured out who he was. And honestly, the thing my aunt still talks about most isn't the footprints or the slashed tire. It's the zipper. The fact that whoever it was waited quietly in the rain outside their tent and slowly opened it while they were sleeping inside.